My parents secretly gave my money to my bully sister. When I cut them off, she said, "I wish I bullied you more." So I exposed her to everyone. Throughout my life, my older sister, Caitlin, harbored resentment towards me, believing I was always trying to steal her spotlight. She seemed determined to undermine everything I enjoyed. Our rivalry went beyond typical sibling behavior. Whenever I dedicated myself to mastering a new skill, she felt compelled to do the same. If I took up archery, she'd suddenly show up at school with a bow and arrows, claiming an interest as well. If I wrote in my diary about having a crush on a guy, she'd start talking to him the next day, acting flirtatious. Even when I tried to adopt a healthier lifestyle to lose weight, Caitlin would immediately jump on the same diet and exercise routine. It became a pattern. My personal choices were constantly mirrored by her actions. This competition extended to friendships and social circles. If I became friends with someone, she'd attempt to integrate herself into the same group, sometimes overshadowing my presence. The constant copying eroded my sense of individuality. Expressing my frustrations to my parents was futile. They'd dismiss my concerns with statements like, "Sisters imitate each other," and considered it inappropriate for me to try to exclude her from my interests. It seemed they enjoyed the constant competition between us, but I just wanted to pursue my own passions in peace. Caitlin was always monitoring my activities, trying to outdo me and creating unnecessary drama. The worst part was that my parents always favored her, even when I was genuinely interested in something first. They'd miss work to attend her recitals but forget about mine. It was as if my achievements didn't matter. Caitlin would take every opportunity to taunt me about how much more our parents loved her, making snide comments under her breath. If I reacted, she'd pretend she had no idea what had upset me. When our parents weren't around, her behavior was even harsher. She made hurtful remarks, suggesting I'd always come second to her in everything. At school, she physically bullied me, tripping me in front of everyone or hitting me, claiming it was just a dare from her friends. When teachers found out, they contacted my parents, threatening Caitlin with suspension. However, my parents told the school it was a family matter and assured them they'd handle it at home. But at home, Caitlin would pretend I had provoked her, justifying her actions. She was never reprimanded, and if our parents questioned her, she'd start crying, claiming I was making everything up. The constant favoritism and Caitlin's relentless need to compete created a toxic environment where I struggled to have something for myself. I didn't want to compete. I just wanted to live my life. My friends eventually started calling her out for her abusive behavior. That's when she escalated, spreading malicious rumors about me. She'd come to school with bruises or cuts, claiming I was responsible. Since I was introverted and disliked discussing my personal life, it was difficult to fight back against these false accusations. Caitlin made sure to talk to every friend I'd ever interacted with, even the guys I liked, trying to convince them of her lies. My high school experience was miserable, and that misery followed me even after Caitlin graduated. She had to take a gap year because she wasn't accepted into any universities due to her low grades. Meanwhile, I'd earned scholarships for college, so my parents didn't have to spend any money on my education. That's when I discovered a devastating truth. My parents had been discussing college funds with Caitlin. They told her they had saved for both of us, but since I no longer needed the money, they were happy to spend both of our college savings on her. They assured her she could study anything she wanted. Furious, I confronted them, but they brushed me off, saying it was their money, and they wanted to help Caitlin because she needed it more. I suggested they save my college fund for me, perhaps to start a business or for my future, but they scoffed, telling me to learn to take care of myself because they were tired of babying me. That night, I cried myself to sleep, heartbroken by the realization that Caitlin would always get everything while I was ignored. When it was time to move into my college dorm, I made sure to take everything with me, determined not to return home. Unsurprisingly, my parents didn't even offer to help me move. At my lowest point, feeling completely abandoned, I met Antonio. He was like a breath of fresh air. We met during one of the orientation events, and his genuine kindness and warm smile immediately drew me in. As we got to know each other, Antonio became my anchor, offering the stability and support I'd always needed. He listened to my story without judgment and provided the comforting presence I'd been missing. During one of my college breaks, my parents insisted I come home for a Christmas celebration. They had invited everyone, and although I didn't want to face my parents alone, I decided to bring Antonio with me. It seemed like a good opportunity to introduce him to my family. I informed my parents beforehand that Antonio and I would be staying separately and that he would be joining us for dinner. When we arrived, my parents were a bit surprised to see him. For context, my parents are conservative, so they naturally judge Antonio's appearance. When I introduced him, I had anticipated this reaction and had already warned Antonio. Despite their initial surprise, Antonio greeted them warmly and even brought a bouquet of flowers for my mother, which immediately softened her attitude. As the evening went on, everyone seemed charmed by Antonio. He complimented the food, engaged in meaningful conversations, and even offered a heartfelt toast to my parents, thanking them for welcoming him. Some of my cousins came up to me, gushing about how lucky I was to have found such a great guy. They even joked about whether Antonio had any younger brothers, which made me laugh. I was genuinely happy that everyone liked my boyfriend, but it was hard to ignore Caitlin's growing disdain. Throughout the night, I noticed her having multiple drinks and whispering with a few relatives. Her discomfort with Antonio's presence was obvious. During dinner, Caitlin suddenly asked me loudly whether I was in a serious relationship with Antonio. Her question caught everyone's attention. I nodded, took Antonio's hand, and confidently told her that we were indeed quite serious. Caitlin smirked, and in front of everyone, insinuated that maybe I should consider settling down with someone more aligned with our family's traditions rather than an outsider. Her blatant disrespect shocked me, and I noticed some of the guests were visibly uncomfortable with her statement. Caitlin continued, suggesting I should think about our cultural differences and choose someone who reflected our family's values more closely. I was furious, about to speak my mind when Antonio calmly smiled and responded with grace. He explained that he was as American as anyone else, having been born in this country. He even shared that his great-grandparents had immigrated to America and that his family had always valued respect for all cultures and beliefs. While I was hurt that Antonio had to defend himself, I was incredibly proud of how calm and composed he remained. It only made me more certain that he was the right person for me. After this awkward exchange, people's opinions of Caitlin were not favorable. The rest of the night, she sat alone, sulking, while others avoided her. When we returned to college, I couldn't hold back my feelings any longer. I sent Caitlin a long message expressing my disappointment and telling her that I no longer wanted her in my life. I made it clear that I was done with her toxic behavior and didn't want to acknowledge her as family anymore. Caitlin replied with a short message, "Same here." Since that day, I've had no contact with her. 3 years ago, Antonio and I got married. I invited my parents to the wedding, but chose not to invite Caitlin, despite my mother trying to convince me otherwise. At the wedding, my parents met Antonio's family and friends. It quickly became clear to them that Antonio's family was wealthy. My mother looked shocked, and my father, who usually didn't talk much, was unusually quiet. After the wedding, my parents approached me, surprised at how much money had been spent. They commented on Antonio's family's wealth and asked about our finances. I explained that Antonio and I could afford a nice wedding because we had built a good life together. I reassured them that while Antonio's family was wealthy, our marriage wasn't about money. I was earning a good salary too. Looking back, I realized it was a mistake to bring up our finances with them. 2 years ago, my parents reached out, saying they needed help. They explained that since my father had retired and they had spent their savings on house renovations, they were struggling financially. They asked for $3,000 a month to cover household bills and medical expenses as they got older. I was surprised by their request because they had never asked for help before. As the black sheep of the family, it felt nice to be needed. At the time, Antonio and I were financially stable. We didn't have children, and I was making a good salary. Without much thought, I agreed to help, feeling responsible. I believed they truly needed support, so I started sending them the money every month. When Antonio found out, he was a little confused, pointing out that $3,000 a month seemed like a lot for my parents to need, but we wanted to help. It became routine, and I never questioned how they were spending the money. During this time, my relationship with my parents improved a lot. I'm not sure if they were genuinely kind or just acting nice because I was helping financially, but I believed we were finally bonding. I even started thinking about forgiving them for their past actions and how we could move forward as a better family. 2 weeks ago, my parents surprised me by calling multiple times in the middle of my workday. Knowing how busy I was, I thought it must be an emergency, so I called them back right away. They asked me to come over because they needed to talk, and I agreed. That evening, after a long day at work, I arrived at my parents' house. They seemed nervous, so I asked if something was wrong. They started by thanking me for the financial help I'd been giving them. I nodded, confused. Then my mom told me some unexpected news. My sister Caitlin, who I hadn't spoken to in years, had gotten married 2 years ago and had been struggling with infertility. I was shocked. I didn't even know she was married, let alone trying to have kids. Mom explained that Caitlin had finally gotten pregnant but had a miscarriage, which left her devastated. Now, Caitlin was thinking about trying in vitro fertilization, IVF, to have a baby, but the procedure was expensive. They said she needed $25,000 to pay for it. My parents looked at me hopefully and told me it was my duty as her sister to help her out. They added that family should always help each other, and this was the least I could do for Caitlin. I was stunned. I couldn't understand why they thought I should be responsible for covering such a huge expense, especially given the strained relationship between Caitlin and me. I reminded them that Caitlin and I had never had a close sibling relationship because she had bullied me throughout my life. I told them there was no way I could give her such a large sum as a gift. They didn't like my response. They insisted that as her sister, it was my responsibility to help Caitlin become a mother. They even said that since I didn't have kids, the least I could do was help bring a grandchild into the family. I tried to be calm and offer a compromise. I said I felt for Caitlin, but I wouldn't give her the money as a gift. However, I was willing to lend her the $25,000 if she signed a legal contract agreeing to pay me back or face legal action. My parents were furious when they heard this. They said it was offensive to even suggest such a thing, and argued that I had plenty of money and should just give it. My mom scolded me, calling me selfish and saying Caitlin needed the money more than I did. I was furious at their entitlement. I reminded them that I had worked hard for everything I had and had my own financial responsibilities. I couldn't just hand over that much money to someone who had made my life difficult and with whom I hadn't spoken in years. I told them that if they didn't agree to my terms, they shouldn't expect any money from me. At this, my parents started yelling. They told me this was why they disliked me so much. They accused me of being arrogant and always acting like I was better than everyone else. I was shocked by their harsh words, especially since they had just been asking me for money minutes earlier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with all the money I'd been sending my parents. Despite their attempt to guilt-trip me, I stood my ground. I excused myself to use the restroom, knowing I only had a short window of time. Quietly, I tiptoed to their bedroom and saw my dad's phone on the bedside table, still plugged into the charger. I knew it was wrong to snoop, but the uneasy feeling in my gut was too strong to ignore. I decided to check his messages. That's when I found the transaction records. $1,800 sent to my sister every month for the past 2 years. I couldn't believe it. My suspicions were confirmed, and the betrayal hit me like a cold wind. It wasn't just about the money. It was realizing they had been manipulating my emotions and lying to me for 2 whole years. My heart raced as I took in the full extent of their deception. I went back downstairs, unable to hide how hurt I was. I directly asked my parents where the $3,000 I had been sending them each month was really going. They looked surprised, stumbling over their words as they tried to explain. I confronted them about the money they were sending to Caitlin, $1,800 each month. Their faces went pale, and for a moment, they were speechless. In the tense silence, the truth started to come out. They admitted they had been secretly sending a large portion of the money I gave them to Caitlin. They tried to justify it by saying she needed the money, and as their parents, they couldn't stand to see her struggle. I was furious. "What about me?" I asked. "Didn't you feel any guilt taking money from me while lying to my face for 2 years?" They said Caitlin and her husband had low-paying jobs, and since I had an extravagant wedding and a stable, well-paying job, they assumed taking the money wouldn't affect me. They also admitted that it was Caitlin's idea originally, and they went along with it because they thought they were just doing what was best for their kids. Fueled by anger and disappointment, I had had enough. I told them I would no longer send them any money and was cutting off all financial support. Desperate and upset, my parents immediately started begging, saying I couldn't abandon my family when they needed help. I scoffed and walked out. As I left their home, I felt a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, and a surprising sense of freedom. Now, as I write this, they continue to call, begging me not to cut them off and promising they won't send any more money to Caitlin. Am I wrong for considering cutting off my parents after their betrayal? It has been difficult for me to share these experiences because many people think I'm either exaggerating or not being honest. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for your support. I feel very emotional knowing that at last people believe my childhood stories. We've both agreed that this will never happen again, no matter what, even if my parents are on their deathbed. In the meantime, my parents continue to call and send messages. They switch between pleading, apologizing, and trying to guilt-trip me into changing my mind. Despite this, I am staying strong in my decision to have no contact. Update 2. It's been 2 weeks since my last update, and something unexpected happened this past weekend. Caitlin reached out to me. I was shocked since I didn't even know she had my number. After all these years, I had hoped her silence meant she had moved on, but I was wrong. Instead of being remorseful, her message was full of anger and accusations. She called me entitled and childish, claiming she had hated me her entire life. She accused me of being a gold digger who married Antonio for his money, saying I didn't deserve it and that as my family, they were entitled to it. Her words were cruel, even saying she wished she had treated me worse as a child so I'd never forget what she was capable of. Reading her message made me feel sick, and I couldn't help but cry. All the trauma I had gone through because of her pain rushing back. Antonio found me in tears and immediately comforted me. Once I told him what had happened, he was furious. Without hesitation, Antonio contacted our lawyer and asked him to draft a cease and desist letter to Caitlin, warning her against any further harassment. We sent the letter the next day. A few days later, I received messages from relatives who had heard about the situation. Apparently, Caitlin had been complaining to anyone who would listen, painting herself as the victim. Fed up, I decided to share my side of the story. I wrote a detailed message explaining everything, from our childhood rivalry to the recent betrayal by my parents and Caitlin's harassment. I sent it to the family group chat, attaching screenshots of Caitlin's hateful messages. As you can imagine, things exploded within a few hours. Relatives quickly responded, shocked at how far my parents had gone to take advantage of me and how shameless Caitlin had been. Some called me directly, and I explained how my parents admitted to sending Caitlin $1,800 each month from the money I gave them. Everyone was outraged, and my parents faced serious backlash. My parents then begged me to delete the group chat and unsend the messages, but I refused. I told them that if they wanted the family to stop judging them, they should take responsibility for their actions. Since then, I've blocked Caitlin and minimized contact with those who sided with her. Antonio and I are focusing on our future, and I'm finally feeling a sense of peace. Update 3. I just want to say that all of you are absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for your support. In just a few days since my last update, I've been overwhelmed by the kindness and encouragement from so many of you. If I could, I'd respond to each of you personally, but I don't have the finger strength for that. Neither my parents nor Caitlin have contacted me, and I'm confident after Antonio's warning that they won't bother us again. I'm focusing on healing and moving forward with my life. Thank you again for believing in me and giving me the strength to stand up for myself. This will be my last update.